Apple is starting out this year with a bang. There are a few new product releases with internal updates, especially with the M2 chip on the inside of it. Let's break this all down and find out which configuration I'm going to get into the studio to run a lot of photography-specific testing. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Apple has announced an update to 3 of their Macs, the Mac Mini, 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. On the outside, the design of these machines are exactly the same as the M1 generation have come before it. So this makes our life somewhat easier in picking the machine that we want to use and add to our workflow, because we no longer have to add in the element of design and really picking over the new design versus the performance, all those kind of things. The same argument we have, for example, with the M2 Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2. Now, that being said, there are a variety of M2 chip that we need to go over, and I'm going to break those down for you. But before we do that, let's quickly talk about the M2 chip. We have seen the M2 chip performance already inside the M2 MacBook Air along with the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2, and in general, they are about 20% faster. So, in essence, if you have an M1 machine right now, or if you are considering getting a machine, you can buy an M1 machine and you can get one with a decent amount of RAM. It can come pretty much head to head with the M2 chip. The other thing to consider as well is that the M1 chip has already been optimized by a lot of software developers. So, I mean, they can really just tackle that chip and really maximize the performance of that one compared to the M2 chip, especially when it was launched in the very beginning with the M2 Air along with the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2. I mean, the performance wasn't quite as good as we were expecting, and a lot of it really just comes down to optimization. Now, chances are some of these software has been optimized for M2 already, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are optimized for the M2 Pro or the M2 Max. The other thing to really consider as well is that if you currently have an M1 generation machine right now and you don't need to upgrade, my recommendation just going out is just to keep the machine that you have. However, if you're a part of a corporation, they're going to update you anyway, I would just consider getting the M2. Or if you're running out of storage, if you are finding out that you're using way more RAM than what you have configured in your system and you want to expand it out, I would maybe consider getting the M2 machine. But if you can find a real great deal for the M1 computer, either in the used market or on Apple refurbished site, or from a friend that is going to upgrade anyway, I might tell you to just go that route instead, because the performance are going to be fairly close to each other. There's going to be some improvement, but I don't think it's going to be night and day that we have seen when Apple announced the M1 chip, and I mean, it just pretty much beat majority Intel chip pretty much to a pulp. We're not going to see those kind of jump. We're just seeing iterative performance upgrade, which is good, but it's going to stair step a lot more than taking the big leap that we were really expecting. All right, with that being said, I want to quickly go over one thing. Now, when it comes to memory configuration on these machines, the best thing to do is really consider your workflow. Just think about how you use your computer. What type of creative are you, or what type of computer user are you? Are you the person that opens a web browser, open maybe 4 tabs, and launch a program, do an edit? When you're done, you shut down the machine. The next time you want to edit again, you launch the machine, you do a fresh restart, and you go through that way. If that is your workflow, you may be able to get away with less RAM on the system than more. However, if you're like me and you're crazy, I have multiple browsers running. Each browser have, I don't even know how many tabs, probably way too many, along with multiple creative apps running at the same time, and Messenger, and also Skype, because I connect with people on Skype as well. I mean, you may want to consider getting a machine with more memory. And many of you have shared your usage condition with me in the comment section of the video. I am more than happy to answer those questions for you. But the best thing that you can do is really figure out your workflow. And to do that, the moment you start up your Mac, launch a program called Activity Monitor. This is built into every Mac. Go into the Memory tab and really see how much memory pressure you're using. If it's green most of the time, that means pretty much the memory that you have in your Mac, it's going to be fine. If it started going to yellow or red, that means you probably want to consider getting more memory on your system. And this is one way to quickly gauge the memory usage on the machine. What I'm doing right now is I'm showing you a remote session to my Mac Studio. This is the M1 Ultra with 64 gigabytes of memory. And the other program that I like to use instead of Activity Monitor, and I highly recommend this, they have a 14-day free trial that you can use. And I'll leave a link to this program in the description below as well. I'm not affiliated with them, but I've been using their software for a very long time. And it's called iStat Menu. With this, they have the memory report, but the moment you install it, it will keep track of your usage by the hour, 24 hours, 7 days, and 30 days. So you can see right now that my memory pressure for the most part, I mean, has been a light holiday usage, is sitting at around maybe like 40–50%. There are some times in the past week or so where I am pushing it to around like, I would say like 60-something% or so, getting close to that 75% mark. But there are other times last year when I'm doing a lot of editing or consistently doing that I'm pushing the memory pressure up beyond 75%. So in general, for me, because I have a lot of tabs open and everything, yeah, I would probably want to consider getting a machine with more memory. For example, 96 gigabytes or 128, whatever is available the next size up. Now, the other thing that you can look at as well is physical memory usage, and you can just go by, again, 1 hour, 24 hours, 7 days, or 30 days. But this gives you a pretty good peer into how you are using your system. And I just wouldn't start your system and not do anything. I would start your system up, have this install, and just use it normally as you go through your course of editing. And this will give you a really great idea into how much you should configure your machine. All right, that being said, let's jump in and talk about the various configurations for the different Macs. So let's start out with the Mac Mini. So with the Mac Mini, we have some capabilities now. We can upgrade to 10 gigabit Ethernet, which is really awesome built in. I mean, that option wasn't available in the beginning. It was available later on in the M1 lineup, but now it's available from day one. So if you are running high-speed networking, you can do that. It also has Wi-Fi 6E, which is like the next generation Wi-Fi. But most importantly, what I really want to point out about the Mac Mini is that if you just get the M2 chip, the back of the machine is pretty much the same as the M1 that have come before it. You got 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, an HDMI, USB-A, headphone jack, and Ethernet. When you go to the M2 chip, what you have is 2 more Thunderbolt 4 ports that are available on the system. So if you want more connectivity, I mean, consider upgrading your machine to the M2 Pro. May not be a bad idea at all. Now, the other thing that I find interesting about the M2 chip is that on the display support, it says that one display with up to 6K resolution at 60 Hz over Thunderbolt and one display with up to 5K resolution at 60 Hz over Thunderbolt. So this means that you can plug in 2 displays using a Thunderbolt connection now without having to resource one display to Thunderbolt, one display to HDMI like the M1 Mac Mini. So we're definitely going to be testing that out when it comes in. And obviously, if you choose to, for instance, configure the Mac Mini with the M2 Pro, that supports up to 3 displays simultaneously. I'll leave a link to the spec page so that you can figure out the different display resolution and everything. However, if you're just using 5K, you're generally going to have a lot of room, or even like 4K displays. You can get 4K 60 on all these displays without a lot of issues at all. All right, now let's talk about the configuration. So Apple likes to give us 3 configurations for these machines, which are really good to look at. So you have, for example, like I would say like the small, medium, and large size per se. But in general, if you take a look at the first 2, they are pretty much the same, with the only difference being the amount of SSD that is available to the machine that you can choose from. So what I'm going to do is choose the mid-tier configuration, and on the other side of my screen, what I'm going to do is choose the M2 Pro configuration, and I'll give you some food for thought about these configurations as well. So first of all, if you just want to pick an M2 machine, there's no M2 option that you choose from. It's always 8 CPU, 10 GPU. That's pretty much all that you have to really choose from in that configuration. What you can do though is upgrade the memory. So for instance, you can upgrade to 16 gigabytes of memory, or you can also upgrade to 24 gigabytes of memory and also SSD, still max out at 2 terabyte for the M2. So if you need something more, obviously, you're gonna look at the M2 Pro. Now, something to keep in mind too, what I have done here is choose the 512 gigabyte configuration, 24 gigabytes of memory, and if we take a look at the price, we're pretty much within a shooting distance of the M2 Pro Mac Mini. Yes, granted, this machine only has 16 gigabytes of memory and so forth, but I mean, it gives you more expansion ports, so you do have, more display support and everything else too. That's something to consider because it is within a stone throw of the other machine. All right, so now let's have a look at the Mac Mini M2 Pro. Now with this, you have 2 chips that you can choose from. There is the base chip, which is M2 Pro with 10 CPU, 16 GPU, or you can upgrade to the 12 CPU, 19 GPU. So essentially you get 2 more CPU core and 3 more GPU cores for $300. My recommendation is to really not pick that option, because what we have seen in the past when it comes to, for example, like M2 Pros chip or M1 Pro for that matter, when it comes to like these extra cores, you're not really seeing that big of a performance gain for the price point that you're really paying. So you're paying $300, but the gain for the most part, it's going to be much smaller than you can really justify that $300. My recommendation, if you're going to spend that money anyway, or if you have that allocated in your budget, is to upgrade to 32 gigabytes of memory, and that's going to take you much further in terms of just the usability of the machine and taking the machine pretty much long term with the usage and everything, especially if you're planning to keep the machine longer. So that would be my recommendation. As far as storage go, 512 would probably be the bare minimum that I would use. Normally I get 512 for my test machine. If it's any of my personal machine that I would use on a daily basis, it has to be at the very minimum 1 terabyte, if not 2. And yes, Apple is charging us quite a bit for that, but it's just pretty much what we have to choose when we configure the machine, because there's really no upgrading. Another thing I want to share as well is the fact that when you configure these machines, you can't upgrade anything in the future, especially with memory. There's really no way to upgrading that. With storage, what you can do is always get an external hard drive, SSD, NAS, whatever that may be. So you can always find a way to expand storage, but you can't find a way to expand memory or RAM on the system. So just make sure to remember that when you're configuring your machine too. Now this configuration looks pretty good right now. It's still, $1699, so it's no longer in like the cheap sub $1,000 territory. But if you take a look at the other machine anyway that I have configured, the M2, not the Pro, just the M2 on the left side of the screen, you can see right now that the price, it's still above $1,000. So adding $500 more, I think you're getting a better machine long run with more memory and everything. So that would be what I would consider, especially if you are a Pro. Now I have one of these configured as well, very similar spec to what you're seeing right now on order. So I'll be testing that as soon as it comes in. So now the next thing we're going to look at is the 14-inch MacBook Pro. This is the one with the M2 Pro and the M2 Max on the inside. So what I'm going to do first, because we have 3 options, is that I will start with the base machine, because the only upgrade from the base to the next one up is pretty much storage to 1 terabyte SSD. So what we're going to do is just start out with the base one, and this way we can see the different configuration for the M2 Pro chip that's available on this machine as well. For the other one, as a comparison, I am going to pick the top spec machine and we'll go from there. All right, with this, starting from the base model, which is on the left side of the screen right now, what you see is that you have very similar to the Mac Mini M1, which is the 10-core CPU, 16-core GPU, and you can upgrade to the 12-core CPU and 19-core GPU. Personally, I would not recommend that you do this, and if you're configuring the machine for the maximum portability, you want to get the best machine possible, I would go with the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Choose the base chip and upgrade the memory to 32 gigabytes of memory, and that's going to take you much further than spending $300 to upgrade to a few more cores on the CPU and GPU. That's something that I have tested and definitely found out in real world results. You're going to see maybe like a minute or two slower in export time, but that doesn't mean a lot at all. And we're talking about 1,000 raw files. Obviously, I'll be doing some testing on this as well when I get the machine in, so I'll be sharing some of those results with you. And that's pretty much the price of the machine that you're looking at right now. But if we start to, for instance, like bump up, I can go in, by the way, to the next M2 Pro, and I'm still stuck with 32 gigabytes of memory. Another thing too that I also want to mention is that, let's quickly go back to the Mac Mini configuration. Some of you are going to ask this question that, well, there's a difference between the memory bandwidth inside the M2 and the M2 Pro, and also the M2 Max as well. So for instance, if I configure these two machines with 16 gigabytes of memory on different chip, one being the M2, the other one being the M2 Pro, am I going to see a difference in real world, scenario? And the answer to that, I can tell you right now, is pretty much no. You're not going to see any variations whatsoever, because most of the time the apps that we have nowadays can't really push the maximum memory bandwidth that are available on these chips just yet. You need to have an app that puts CPU, GPU, and also Neural Engine to the max all the time in order for you to even maximize anything. So we're not going to see that much variations in performance at all when it comes to that. Most of the time the performance gain you're going to see is from going from the M2 to the M2 Pro, which has more high performance cores on the chip itself. You're going to see more performance gain coming from that. All right, let's go back to the 14-inch MacBook Pro and talk about a few other different options. So the thing about the top spec with the M2 Mac chip is that you have two different options. So you have the 12 CPU, 30 GPU, and the 12 CPU, 38 GPU. So a couple things to note here is that once you have reached the 12 CPU core on the M1 Pro, that's pretty much the max, and it is the same amount of CPU core inside the M2 Pro and the M2 Max. The only thing you're gaining going from the M2 Pro, the top one, to the M2 Max is more GPU cores on the system. And the only case scenario where I would say it's worth that upgrade in pricing, I would say for Lightroom Classic and Lightroom, because it uses GPU acceleration for exporting now, you're going to see some of the performance gain. If you're using Capture One, I would probably say that, you know, the M2 Max, the one with the 30 GPU core, is going to be like the sweet spot. Although I would probably say, like, I don't know how the performance is going to be, because Capture One never really performs or scale well with the GPU that are in the system anyway. And even with the current M1 Crop machine and their latest, for example, Capture One release, I haven't seen that big of a performance leap or jump that I would expect to see, for example, when we double the GPU core. So if you're using Capture One, I would definitely save the money. All right, but if you want the highest spec machine possible, what can you do? Well, if you just choose, for example, in the 14-inch, the base M2 Max, what you have the option to is choose between 32 and 64 gigabytes of memory. If you want to go to the higher 96 gigabytes of memory, you have to choose the M2 Max, the one with the 38 GPU option. This is pretty much the high-end option. And with this, you have the option to choose between 32, 64, and 96 gigabytes of memory. So some delineation there that you want to note. Now, how many of you would really be configuring these machines with 96 gigabytes of memory? I would say is probably very rare. The other thing too I want to give you anecdotally is think about your workflow and the type of modality you work in. For example, I am a desktop and laptop user, meaning that majority of the times when I'm at my office, I use my desktop. That is the machine that's on 24/7 and I use it the most. When I'm on the road, I'll use my laptop. But with that in mind, I don't have to configure a laptop to be as powerful or anything like that, because it's not an all-encompassing machine for me, because I have a more powerful machine at home. So that's something that you need to think of as well. Now, if this is going to be your singular machine that you're going to use and you want to get the best performance possible, I would say, yeah, maybe considering getting the M2 Max. But note though that, you know, you're going to see some performance throttling when the chip heats up and everything. So those are another factor to think about as well. Other than that, we're just talking about storage, which you can still configure it with 512 if you want to. For instance, I can configure the M2 Max with 512 by starting from the base configuration machine, as you're seeing on the left side of the screen right now. But the moment you get into the Max territory, you're going to start getting into the high $2,000 to $3,000 price range very easily. And lastly, let's go over the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro and M2 Max chip. Again, we have three different options. So what I'm going to do is start first with the base model. That will be our comparison on the left side, and I am going to pick the top range model, which is going to be on the right side of the screen. So for the top range one, pretty much Apple will pre-configure that with 38 core GPU. The top M2 Max, you can't change that whatsoever. You can choose the amount of memory you want in your system. For example, 32, 64, and 96, which is quite a bit of memory that you can really use. And if you start out with the base model, you have a little bit more room, although the range of chip that is available on the 16-inch is a little bit more limited to like the upper or higher end chip compared to the 14-inch model, where you have the entry M2 Pro chip available too. So this one is pretty much the top spec already, 12 core CPU, 19 GPU. Now, if you're going to upgrade to the 30 GPU core and spend $200, I'd probably argue that if you're not really using Capture One, just stick with the base one and upgrade to 32 gigabytes of memory. I think you're going to get much more gain out of that. Although if you want to find a good combo between the two and just really upgrade to 32 gigabytes of memory, the Max, like the base Max, is something to consider as well. And if you want to go all out, you can go with 38 core GPU. Although I highly doubt we're going to see, you know, for example, Capture One being able to utilize that well. Now, when it comes to Lightroom Classic, we're probably going to see some GPU acceleration difference, Lightroom Classic, between these two models. As far as does it justify all these price jump or not, well, we're going to be determining that when we have the machine in to run the testing. And again, with the top specs, you can choose between 32, 64, and 96 gigabytes of memory. If I go down to the base M2 Max, what I get is 32 and 64 only, so you don't have the access to the top memory. And I think a lot of that has to do and correlates with the amount of GPU that is available on the system and the die as well. As far as storage go, 512, if you're going to get these machines, 512 is very limiting. I probably just really put in the extra money and go with a 1 terabyte storage. This way you have a little bit more room when you're on the road, portability, and also the space to store, any work that you may have instead of actually carrying extra SSD. You should always carry that or have one for backup and everything, but if you just want a little bit more room, I definitely recommend 1 terabyte. So that has been the lineup for the M2 and M2 Pro Mac Mini, along with the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro and M2 Mac chip. There's really a lot to break down and a lot to consider when you're really building and configuring these machines. So I hope that these talks just guide you a little bit. If I find any more information about these machines and anything else, I will also share them with you in the following days. And I have a few machines on order, so we'll definitely be testing those in the photography app, and we'll also be doing external display tests and calibration on them as well. One more thing as well is that these machines, Apple update the HDMI to the 2.1 standard. So now it supports, I believe, 8K, and it can also do HDR and all these other things. So the standard has been updated, which is a great thing. Anyway, I hope you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in Art we trust.